Agreed. The honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to hearing the intervention of the member for Louis St. Laurent, but I will make my comments today as a lead-off for His Majesty's loyal opposition on Bill C-47. That's the Liberals' budget implementation bill. The question before us, well, we'll see. The question before us is, can you trust that anything in this budget bill will actually be true when we look at the promises of these Liberals compared to the results? So I want to put this record spending in this budget plan into some historical context. I know the Liberals are a little challenged sometimes on math, so please bear with me. I hope you can follow it. In the federal election of 1968, yes, I was very, very small, Pierre Trudeau reassured Canadians that a Liberal government would not raise taxes or increase spending. The government, he said during the election, was not Santa Claus. So how did that work out? When Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister, real government spending increased from 17% of GDP to 24.3%. In other words, the federal government's share of the economy rose 42% under Pierre Trudeau. Every single area of federal government spending increased except defense spending, where Pierre Trudeau cut spending in half as a percentage of the budget. When Pierre Trudeau took office, we spent more on national defense than we did on servicing the country's debt. When he left office in 1984, for every dollar the government spent on defense, we spent $3 on paying the interest on his national debt. Let's look at it another way. The deficit Pierre Trudeau ran in his last year of office was 8.3% of GDP. Based on Canada's GDP in 2022, Pierre Trudeau's 8.3% of GDP deficit would be like a $157 billion deficit today, annually. His record was to drive Canada's debt from $262 billion when he became Prime Minister to $700 billion when he left office. Pierre Trudeau added $438 billion to Canada's debt, almost tripling it. This from a Liberal leader that said he would not run deficits when he was first elected in 1968, and that government was no Santa Claus. I raise this because, as the adage goes, like father, like son. By the time Trudeau left office in 1984, 38 cents of every dollar the federal government spent was to pay interest on the debt that he had built up. You see, Trudeau's policies of massive spending led to a rapid rise in interest rates to try to reduce inflation. All that government spending simply made it worse. Interest rates rose to 21%. Like his father, this Liberal leader promised Canadians in his first election as leader in 2015 that even though Canada was running a robust growing economy and had a balanced budget left by the Harper government, that he would spend modest stimulus deficits, but that in 2019 it would be balanced. Here's what the Liberal platform that these Liberals all stood on in 2015 said. We will run modest deficits for 3 years so that we can invest in growth for the middle class and credibly offer a plan to balance the budget in 2019. We will reduce the federal debt to GDP ratio to 27%. So, did he balance the budget at the end of his first term as he promised? And as his father also promised in his first term that he would have a balanced budget? No, like father, like son, these Liberals produced a $20 billion deficit in 2019. So promises made, promises broken. Did the Liberals reduce their first fiscal anchor of 27% of GDP? No, it was 31% in 2019. So another promise made, promise broken. In the new Liberal budget after re-election in 2019, there was no longer talk of a balanced budget. Nope, the debt to GDP ratio was the new fiscal anchor, and it would remain the same during the 4 years of that fiscal plan, even though that meant they would be spending more. Well, we know at least that the promise to spend more and not the balance of budget was true, then we had an early and unnecessary election in 2021. What did the Liberal platform say then about their promises for the country's finances? No talk of balanced budgets until perhaps, maybe 2050. But they did make a promise to drop the debt to GDP ratio from 48.5% in 2021-22. Remember that in 2019, their campaign promise said that in 2022, that the debt to GDP ratio would be 31%, not 48%. So what does this bill project for this year? The budget set the cumulative spending for the next 5 years at a record $3.1 trillion. If these numbers are to believe, and remember, in the fall they promised that the budget would be balanced, and they don't add more spending in the rest of their term, they will add another $130 billion to the national debt. The national debt will rise to a record $1.3 trillion. Interest on the national debt that the Liberals project will rise from $44 billion a year to $50 billion a year in 5 years, if you can believe the interest rate projections that they have in this budget. $50 billion in interest is $10 billion more than we spend on national defense. There are $84 billion in new tax credits for business over the next 5 years. Liberals project inflation this year will be 3.5% in 2023 and roughly 2.1% thereafter. For this to happen, inflation will need to drop from 5.5% now to 2% in July to stay there for the next 5 years. Not likely. $3.1 trillion in spending with massive deficits, pour gasoline on the inflation fire, so these inflation rates are ridiculous. The last year of our government, the federal government spending was $280 billion with a $1.9 billion surplus. This year, the budget projects $456 billion in spending, up $176 billion, or 63%, since these Liberals took office. The fiscal framework projects the government spending to be $543 billion if there's no further spending in the rest of the term, and that's $263 billion more than in 2015, a 94% increase in spending. The increase alone is almost as much as the entire budget in 2015. Revenue, or taxes, have risen $282 billion since 2015, so we know it's not a revenue problem because revenue's gone up 92%. Pierre Trudeau and the son, the current Liberal leader, combined at the end of this bill's plan, will have contributed $1.1 trillion to Canada's national debt.
Same.
Pierre Trudeau always spent more than he promised. After 8 years of these Liberals, the son has done the same. Promises made, promises broken. Canadians simply can't afford any more Trudeaus. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question et comment.